I sailed alone around the world, but of course had help from many other people. Here I thank those who gave me significant assistance and apologize for anyone I have left out, as there were many others I met who helped in various ways, even if just by their companionship, as the cruiser community is one of the friendliest I have known. Here I describe them in roughly chronological order of when I first met them. My wonderful wife of 31 years, Christina Nordom, was obviously the most important person enabling and sustaining my circumnavigation. Christina is a devoted mother to Erica and Gabriel, a good cook, an enthusiastic gardener, a lifelong artist and seamstress, and loves working on houses, this time one of our neighbors. On our first trip to Panama in September 2019, she was my Spanish translator as we visited the canal and enjoyed an eco-resort. Plus, of course, we saw Sea Change, which led me to purchase her in October. Christina then accompanied me on my first shakedown cruise to the San Blas Islands in November 2019, and again in November 2021. In March of 2022, she, along with Gabriel and my kiting friend Ken Moyer and his brother Glenn, from right to left, thanks guys, flew out to Panama to be line handlers for the canal passage. In June 2022, she and Erica joined me for a week in Whakarava, when I was looking rather wild, and again in New Zealand in 2024, where we had 3 weeks traveling around both islands in a camper van, including visiting Whangarei, where Sea Change was stored in nearby Marsden Cove Marina. Finally, she came to Cape Town in January 2025 for a month, with me looking a bit more presentable. Christina is also a sailor, but she prefers racing the Thistle dinghy that she shares with Ken. Through all 4 seasons I was off sailing solo, Christina kept the home fires burning, handled all sorts of financial issues, dealt with email while I was at sea, and helped sort out problems with the Iridium satellite phone and Predict Wind service, as well as repairs to the Pacific Wind Pilot wind vane and the Raymarine tiller autopilot. Thank you, dear. The day I arrived in Panamarina, the small marina on the north side of Panama where Sea Change was on the hard, in November 2019, to get her into the water for the shakedown cruise to the San Blas Islands, I met Jakob and Christelle Reed, the 2 people who helped me with Sea Change the most, here on the right, when celebrating my getting Sea Change into the water for the first time. These 2 Namibians had sailed their Endurance 37 cutter, Sangaree, from Durban in South Africa to the Caribbean 12 years earlier, where they sailed extensively and then settled in Panama, based in the San Blas Islands as charter hosts. Jakob helped me with so many things it is impossible to list them all, but including welding up a stainless steel security grid for the companionway and a hoist on the port pushput for the heavy outboard. He also replaced the rivets on the 20 mast steps when I was still recovering from shoulder surgery, repaired the mainsail batten cars and gave me his long spare batten, attached a used winch which I bought for the mast for hoisting the dinghy onto the foredeck, installed the big new solar panel on top of the bimini and wired it to a new controller, and reamed out the engine exhaust elbow to stop overheating issues, plus innumerable other things like showing me how to change the oil in the engine and transmission, tighten the stuffing box, etc. Christelle undertook several sewing projects, including reinforcing the UV strip on the Genoa, repairing the main sail leech, converting their spare staysail from hanks to luff tape for me, and worked on the bimini, plus cooked up some wonderful meals on Sangaree. They treated us to fish barbecues alongside their charter guests on the beach of an uninhabited island in the San Blas when we were on our shakedown cruises, and even visited us in Urbana. Here they are at the end of the table for my celebration of splashing Sea Change the second time, and sharing dinner with other friends on our final evening in Panamarina. In March 2022, Jakob sailed with me from Panamarina to Shelter Bay Marina at the north entrance to the canal to ensure the sails, tiller autopilot and other equipment worked correctly, plus taught me VHF protocol. And I called on them for advice regularly the next 4 years. There were lots of other folk at Panamarina over the 6 visits I made there who helped me in various ways. In particular, Archibald Hoyte, in the front left here with his wife Lucia on the front right, at a celebratory dinner when I first splashed Sea Change in November 2019. A superb diesel mechanic named Nelson serviced the injectors to get the diesel running. A German chap named Armin Zimmermann on the right here with a white trimaran on a mooring next to Sea Change kept an eye on her for 16 months during COVID and also serviced the head for me. Other sailors made my final stay in March 2022 enjoyable, like these 3 women, each with their own boats, Katrin, Suzanne, and Mary, who invited me to join their early morning walks. Others helped me install the Raymarine Tiller autopilot and a new VHF AIS unit, plus assisted with dinghies. It was a special little rotating community at Panamarina, and I also thank the owners, Jean-Paul and Sylvie Marpeau, for their hospitality. After the canal, I had a few days in La Playita Marina in Panama City before leaving, and had the good fortune of meeting Americans Brian and Meg Sharwood. Brian helped me with my Iridium Go satellite phone, as well as the AIS receiver aspect of my new VHF radio, which I had trouble figuring out. We amazingly met up again in Hakatia Bay on Nukuhiva, and then in Opur, here in a selfie by mutual cruising friend Barry, and finally again in Pancake Creek in Queensland, on the left here. Jim Westerveld is a sailing, windsurfing and kitesurfing friend in Illinois, who is also a computer guru, in the middle here with Christina and Ken. I foolishly set sail from Panama without getting my PredictWind services through the Iridium Go satellite phone completely set up, as revealed by the absence of a track for the first little bit out of Panama City. And then Jim came to my rescue by setting up the PredictWind tracker and blog a few days later, which was a huge relief and forms the record of my trip, especially as I lost my first 2 iPhones and an older iPad I used for my iSailor charts and hence my track on them for the first 2 years. He also helped with weather information and routing and helped me figure out the PredictWind weather forecasts so that I eventually became independent. I first met Australian Ian Watson in Hakatia Bay on Nukuhiva, where he was anchored on his 53-foot home-built ketch called Jasmine, along with an intimidating dog named Banjo. He joined a group of 12 cruisers in the cockpit of Sea Change one evening, on the right here. Sadly, my photo skills were so poor, half the 12 people on board are cut off. And later helped me replace the sacrificial pin on the propeller of my 2-horsepower Yamaha outboard when I sheared it on a rock. We met again in Whakarava, where he kindly used his dinghy to ferry Christina and Erica to and from shore as my dinghy was in bad shape. There I invited Ian on board Sea Change to offer advice on maintaining an old boat, and he suggested checking the wires in the standing rigging at the tops of the bottom swages, something I only got around to in Beveridge Reef, discovering to my horror that each had at least one broken strand. Learning of this, Ian suggested the long stud staylocks that I later used to replace all 8 bottom swages in Wunderpoint Marina at the end of 2022. We met again in Wunderpoint Marina in Fiji in 2023 before I set off for New Zealand and he back to Australia, completing his 2nd circumnavigation, where I eventually visited him at his hometown of Innisfail on the Queensland coast for a fish and chips dinner, followed by dessert. I met Scott at sea as we approached Makimo Atoll in the Tuamotus of French Polynesia, and he took the first and still best pictures of sea change sailing. He advised me on how to approach my first Tuamotu pass, and while he was able to get in on his big AML called Tangay, the outflow was far too much for sea change, and I had to leave, and 2 days later made it into the North Pass. We later met up again at Harifu Motu in the southeast corner of Fakarava Atoll, where we kite surfed together, and he reinforced warnings I had read about ciguatera poisoning with an account of his own poisoning. But sadly, I neglected to get a picture of him and his partner Mia. On the last island of French Polynesia, called Mapiaha, I had the good fortune to meet Don and Tessa Stolmeyer on their custom-built catamaran called Ballerina Girl, and was invited along with them by the only family on the island for a dinner feast. Don was the longtime manager of Powerboats Marina in Trinidad, and insisted that if I got there I should visit, which I did in 2025, with engine issues that required Don coming out on his motorboat and towing me in. He and Tessa were wonderful hosts there, touring me around, and I got to see his latest boat project, a power catamaran. Nearing the end of my first season in 2022, I met Australians Brett and Tess on their Corbin 44 named Complicity in Fulanga at the southeast corner of Fiji, and we buddy sailed across to nearby Ongia to the east, but again I failed to get a picture of them. Instead, they took these gorgeous drone shots of our boats in this amazingly sheltered anchorage. These are the only drone shots I have of sea change. I gave them lots of my spare food when I left for Wunderpoint Marina so they could stay out longer, and then they kindly kept an eye on sea change as they stayed at or near Wunderpoint for cyclone season. And they also ran the engine once a month, which surely helped, because when I returned 10 months later, it started and ran perfectly. At the start of my second season in 2023, I sailed back from Fiji to Tonga, and in the northern Vavau group of islands, I met up with Casper and Sophie Holmgaard, two Danes on their gorgeous big turquoise boat named Velodia, with a crew of 8 young Danes. They took me under their wing and invited me to join a local feast ashore, and took me along on snorkeling trips, including into the famous Mariner's Cave. In return, I gave a couple of their crew beginner kite flying lessons, plus kited with Casper at this gorgeous island called Maunu. Later in Naefu, we all had a memorable dinner, along with Jean Socrates and the crew of recently dismasted Dance Me, and they all came over for a visit on Sea Change the evening before I left Tonga. Casper and Sophie are at the back here. I met up with Casper and Sophie again in Mululaba on the Queensland coast in 2024, where they were selling Velodia, and they kindly gave me some surplus gear from her. On my second visit to the entry port of Savu on Vanuatu in Fiji in 2023, I had the amazing good fortune to meet Californians Ed and Fran McLaughlin on their home-built boat named Aka, here on a mooring at Waitea Marina, peeking out in front of a catamaran monstrosity, and here in pictures from them, as once again I failed to take any of them. They had been out cruising for 25 years, and while Ed helped me solve many issues on board Sea Change, including problems with my 5-horsepower 2-stroke Mercury outboard, Fran was a delight to walk the shops with, as they were regulars in Savu and knew all the best places. When I learned she was shopping for a replacement for Ed's phone that had died, I gave him my spare Android. We reconnected in Opua in New Zealand at the end of that year, and when Ed heard I had messed up the forward gear plates in my transmission because I failed to notice a leaking seal, he connected me with Brian, a retired master marine mechanic specializing in transmission repair in his retirement, who swapped the forward and reverse plates and replaced all the seals. Brian also reconditioned a used transmission that Ed negotiated a sale for from another friend, and which I had occasion to use later in Cape Town. Like Jacob Reed, Ed became a regular source of advice on other difficulties over the next 2 years. Glenn and Pat are an English couple who had been cruising on their home-built steel boat, Northern Rose, for 23 years, on the right here, and I was lucky to meet them in the famous Blue Lagoon anchorage off Nanuna Island in the Yasawa group on the western side of Fiji in 2023, shown here on the right with their friends Matt and Elizabeth on Rubicon, who have cruised for even longer. Glenn is a retired Yanmar engine mechanic, and when my engine would not start the next morning, he kindly came over and helped me figure out the problem, which turned out to be a loose diesel bleeder bolt. I would meet them again in Whangarei. Like Jacob Reed and Ed McLaughlin, I felt comfortable calling Glenn up for subsequent engine advice. Vince Salgado is a fellow retired entomologist and avid kitesurfer I met in the Outer Banks of North Carolina some years ago. When I mentioned some problems in my blog, he came to the rescue. First, he bought the correct LED lamps for my masthead anchor and navigation lights and sent them to Christina to bring to Whakarava. Then, when I was struggling with engine starting issues in a remote anchorage in Fiji, he coached me through diagnosis of the problem over the Iridium satellite phone, concluding that it was an issue with the negative wire from the starter battery to the engine. I was able to get the engine started with his help, and eventually in Port Vila in Vanuatu the next year completely solved the problem by replacing this old, long and thin wire with a new, shorter and thicker cable. I met Englishman David Mitchell and New Zealander Sue Cockram on the visitors' dock at Marsden Cove Marina in November 2023, when David, aged 80, arrived solo from Tonga on his beautiful Bowman 48 named Shandon. They kindly invited me to dinner on board, and later Sue gave me a ride down to Auckland for my flight to South Africa. As is often the case, I said we would happily host them in Cape Town sometime, and they took me up on the offer in January 2024 for a tour around the area, and then asked us to act as guides for a trip to Kruger National Park, here eating remaining food at a roadside picnic on the way back to Johannesburg. In March 2024, they were our first stop on our campervan trip around New Zealand, and served us a marvelous meal at their home near Tauranga. Jean-Pierre Nortke is a fellow South African I met in Opur the day after I arrived in 2023. He got caught in a strong storm offshore and suffered some damage to his 540 crystal spray, including transmission problems. Having managed to extract his transmission himself, he encouraged me to do the same with mine, and later helped me get a stuck oil filter off my engine. The evening before I left Opur for Season 3, I treated JP, the mechanic Brian, and Ed and Fran to dinner at the yacht club there, but stupidly failed to get a picture. I first met Christoph Reichmann in Opur as we waited for a weather window to head north from New Zealand. Along with Estonians Carl and Anne on Serenada, we agreed to try to buddy boat to New Caledonia and beyond. And here they are, Carl on the right with one of his crew, and tall Christoph with his crew Frederick, outside the immigration building in Noumea, in New Caledonia, where we all arrived just as the political unrest of May 2024 broke out. We had to break into the building via the security gate behind them to get officially into the country. Here we are listening to plans by the local French sailors in case the unrest reached the marina. Eventually we left for Vanuatu, where Christoph and I met up again in Port Vila, where his gorgeous aluminum OVNI 38.5 called Tin Lizzie was looking spectacular. Christoph and I buddy boated north through Vanuatu, including a festival on Ambrym Island and watching land diving on Pentecost Island. The last picture is from Christoph because at the end of this hot day we went for a swim in a river and I forgot my iPhone 8 in my pocket and ruined it. We parted company when he sailed to Indonesia to drop off Frederick there and I sailed west to Australia. Later, I was a few days behind Christoph in Cocos-Keeling and found his German flag memento hanging in the shelter there. I almost caught up with him at Mauritius and finally did in Richards Bay in South Africa, where he and others helped me get into a slip in the absence of reverse gear in my transmission. From there, we sailed together to Durban, where he again helped me berth, and we had breakfast with Nick on Draak, and together had a road trip to see rock paintings in the Drakensberg foothills. I left Durban for the intimidating, long, fast leg to my hometown of East London in company with Christoph and Nick, and there Christoph and I had another road trip to the Hogsback Mountains. We met up again in Cape Town, where he joined a group I guided on a hike up Table Mountain, and finally I took Christoph and his friend Per on Link 1 shopping before they headed north, while I stayed on for another month. Although we did not end up buddy boating much, I enjoyed the company of Estonians Carl and Anne, and after our escapade in New Caledonia, we next met briefly in Rodrigues and then in Mauritius, where we sailed alongside. Here is their French-designed Carafe Il Disco ketch, named Serenada, with entirely Hank-on foresails, and their lovely pictures of sea change with reduced sail as I sailed down from Cargadas Carajos shoals. At the end of 2024, they were in Cape Town when I arrived under tow, and Anne was taking pictures of us being escorted into the Royal Cape Yacht Club. I met two Australians, Gerald and Mari Barink, in Pancake Creek just north of Bundaberg on the North Queensland coast, where they were anchored on their unusual home-built catamaran called Cactus Island, with a catamaran dinghy of similar design. Gerald had assisted me with advice online before we met, and they kindly took me along on a walk to the top of nearby Busted Head and tour of the restored Lighthouse Museum there, where we had the good fortune of meeting the last lightkeeper and architect of the restoration, Stuart Buchanan, and I bought his book about its tragic history. They provided me with lots of information about anchorages up the Queensland coast, and I routinely sought more along the way. Recently they made me envious with this picture of Cactus Island anchored off a picturesque island in the Solomons. Australian Shane Dennis and American Mary Larson bought Sea Change in Duluth, Minnesota in 2012, after she had spent her first 22 years on the Great Lakes. They did a wonderful job of fitting her out for cruising, including lots of safety gear and adding the bimini with solar panels. In retrospect, I'm amazed they sailed her from there to Panama without a Dodger windlass or wind vane. They maintained her excellently and sold her quickly so she did not rot in the tropical sauna of Panama. Shane communicated extensively with me about Sea Change after I bought her, and eventually I got to meet them in Cairns, where they helped me remove the mainsail, and at their home Mary gave me long pieces of sail tape to reinforce the leech, and we added the fourth reef I had long desired. Plus, we sewed an extra canvas layer on the top of the Dodger to waterproof it, albeit here pooped on by noddies. While on the topic of previous owners, in 2016 Shane and Mary sold Sea Change to a young couple, Lubna and Eike, Norwegian and Icelander, who kept her at Panamarina when not sailing around the Caribbean during the dry season. They added the Dodger, the Lofren's Tigris windlass, and the Pacific Wind Pilot wind vane, and I thank them for all of those. They also kindly answered many emailed questions about Sea Change. When I arrived in Yorkeys Knob Marina north of Cairns, the crew of the boat next to my slip quickly assisted in taking my lines, something I always appreciated as a solo sailor entering a new marina. And so I met Australians David and Serena Isles on their Beneteau First 41.5 called Lady Contessa. We subsequently sailed north to Thursday Island, often in company at anchorages, and one day got photos of each other, although not without some excitement, as they passed very close to our stern. Here they are on Lady Contessa as I left the anchorage at Hook Island, opposite Thursday Island. We met again in Darwin, and when I was approaching the customs and immigration dock there to check out, they again came down to take my lines, which was extremely fortuitous, because I came in way too hot, and then my reverse gear did not work, because it turned out I had burnt the plates, setting the anchor at Hook Island, and their quick action getting my lines onto bollards saved me from ploughing into the back of a fancy boat tied up in front of us. Another boat regularly accompanied us in anchorages along the North Queensland coast. This gorgeous Dufour 50 called Nadkika, with German Boren and Scott Lisa on board. It turned out that we had been in Savu Savu in Fiji and later Apua in New Zealand together, but had not met up before. Here they hosted David and Serena and me for a meal on board. We too later met up again, anchored next to each other in Fanny Bay in Darwin, where they took me along in a rental car for an extended shopping trip around Darwin, and I hope to return the favor in Cape Town at the end of this year. Upon my arrival in Christmas Island, there was another solo sailor there, Ralph Bender from Switzerland, on his grey aluminum Finot 44 raceboat called Z, that he fitted out for cruising and sailed non-stop solo from his adopted Spain to the west coast of Australia, surviving several near disasters along the way. Ralph is a rather unconventional sailor whose company I enjoyed a lot, including on a hilarious tour of the island with local host Nigel, visiting shrines, an abandoned space center, finding coconut crabs, and splitting coconuts. Ralph invited us on board for a meal of paella and taught me to cook it, which I did repeatedly, even from flying fish. We met up again in Mauritius, where Ralph kindly led me past the reefs into Grand Bay, under sail, as I was engineless for a while. I got to South Africa before Ralph, but we eventually met up again when he and his new crew, Joseph, anchored in Saldanha Bay north of Cape Town, and I drove up to bring them to hike up Table Mountain, but sadly took no pictures. As noted, Ralph is not your typical cruiser, and again demonstrated that on his way back to Europe with Joseph, by sailing up the west coast of Africa instead of heading across the South Atlantic to Brazil and the Caribbean like the rest of us. I first met English sailor Bill Horn in Cocos Keeling on Carramore, his westerly Ocean Lord 41. At age 79 and doing his first real ocean sailing, much like me, he was struggling a little with his big heavy boat, including broken strands at the bottom swages of both inner shrouds, something I had struggled with in Fiji 2 years earlier. So I helped him sister chains across the swages. I had a potential medical emergency there when I developed large floaters in my left eye that might lead to a detached retina, and in the absence of cell service at the Direction Island anchorage, Bill kindly offered me his Starlink internet, which I used to research the problem and contacted Frank Howes, a high school friend who is an ophthalmologist I had visited in Surfers Paradise in Queensland, to ask advice, and then booked tickets to fly to Perth for 3 days to get my eye examined. Luckily, there was no serious problem, and I was cleared to continue sailing across the Indian Ocean to Rodrigues, where we met up again, and I rented a car for a trip to the top of the island, including these 3 other cruisers. From left to right, Norbert and Inga on Marisol, Tom on Skyfall, and then Bill and me. Our final meeting was in Mauritius, where he arrived with a badly torn Genoa, and I again rented a car for a drive to Lemoorn on the southwest corner for kitesurfing, and along the way we took his genoa to a sailmaker, who also replaced the broken rigging. I first met Nick, a Canadian who had sailed solo from Vancouver, when I approached the high concrete dock that serves the customs office at Port Louis in Mauritius, where we were both checking out of the country, and attempted to tie up behind his Dreadnought 32 called Drak. In the absence of reverse gear, I almost ploughed into the back of his boat, but he shrugged it off, saying I would have done more damage to sea change. Nick is an old-school sailor in this modern age. Having no autopilot or wind vane, he is sailing around the world using only sheet-to-tiller steering via his staysail sheet. While he does use GPS and electronic charts, for most of the time he did not have AIS receiving, which in particular made the passage around South Africa in lots of shipping exhausting. When I rose the first morning in Durban to walk the docks, I found Drak tied up to the quarantine dock and persuaded Nick to join Christoph and me for breakfast, and then to join us for our trip to the Drakensberg foothills. And here Drak follows Tin Lizzie and me out of Durban Harbour for the long leg to East London, where Nick arrived in the early hours of the morning and anchored in front of me. He had suffered major tears in his mainsail on this passage, so did not accompany Christoph and me on our road trip from East London, but we exited the harbour together, with me helping him solve paperwork issues with harbour control as we left. Nick was sailing on a minimal budget and also hated to be tied to a dock, so he anchored out almost everywhere, including in Durban Harbour and East London and later Saldanha Bay. But that was not possible in our next stop of Port Elizabeth, where he finally had to take a berth for 2 nights. We parted company there, but I later visited him on Drak in Saldanha Bay, where we marveled at the huge flocks of cormorants. Sadly, I could not persuade him to come to Cape Town to see the city and climb Table Mountain. I greatly appreciated Nick's spirit and enthusiasm. Plus, his boat was not only green, but like Sea Change, was designed by Bill Creelock. In parting, he gave me several books, including this classic guide to some of the Caribbean islands. I actually met Belgian sailor Sana Lever back in Wonderpoint Marina in Fiji, where she had her boat Pirouette, having sailed from Europe around Patagonia with her now ex-husband. She and crew Wim then sailed Pirouette to Australia, where she was sold, and I never anticipated seeing Sana again. But by fortuitous coincidence, she arrived in Cape Town while I was there to deliver a Holberg Rassie 46 called the Bounty to Belgium, the owners having bailed on their circumnavigation. Once again, she had Wim on board, plus a newbie sailing crew, Nick, on the left here. They joined one of my hikes up Table Mountain, and after some difficulties with the in-mast furling, chased me to St. Helena, where we enjoyed meals and other activities together, like this coastal hike. I again left ahead of them, but only by a day, so they easily caught up and gave me another great picture of sea change sailing. This time with the 4 sails only configuration I used for most of the South Atlantic crossing. I finally caught up with them at Fernando de Noronha, where again we had various excursions, including in a buggy Wim rented for us, picking up sugarcane juice and bananas and hiking trails. We parted company here as I headed up to French Guiana and the Caribbean, while Sana, with new crew, sailed directly to Martinique and then on to Belgium. As a solo sailor, I usually made a point of meeting other boat crews in most anchorages and marinas, like Hakatea Bay here, not least to have someone to talk to, and hence met many more cruisers along the way, all friendly and often social and helpful, far too many to include everyone in this video. But if any are watching, you know who you are, and I thank you. I also thank the denizens of the Cruising Anarchy subforum at the Sailing Anarchy website, who offered advice and criticism once I screwed up my courage to start a thread there during Season 1 called Sailing the South Pacific. While I did not always take their advice and not all approved of some of the things I did, I always appreciated their contributions and frequent encouragement. Finally, I have to thank Bill Krelock posthumously for designing the Pacific Seacraft line and the company now led by Steve Brody in North Carolina for such a robust build, plus the at least 4 sets of previous owners who enhanced and kept Sea Change in good shape till I was fortunate enough to buy her in 2019. Inevitably, I put a lot more wear and tear on her, but her new owner, Ryan, is young and enthusiastic, so I have hopes for ocean sailing days ahead of her. I end with this picture of Sea Change as I last saw her moored in Manatee Pocket in Stewart in Florida in August 2025.